Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues. With this video, I'll be discussing my thoughts on the entirety of Season 3 of Sherlock. I absolutely had a blast with this season, all 3 episodes. The movie length being, meaning that basically you can put so much into these particular stories, and I absolutely just loved it. Much as was the case with Seasons 1 and 2 of this series, I was thoroughly enthralled by the performances, the adaptations of stories, existing elements of stories, references to the classic Holmes canon. I am a thorough Sherlockian. I've read the entirety of the canon at least 3 times, each story separately 3 times over, all the originals by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And then I've gone back and cherry-picked, my favorite stories I'll read like half a dozen times now since I very first read them and everything. And, I've also read, spin-off material and stories inspired by the characters, by other authors and such like that. So I feel like, semi-knowledgeable about the characters. And I think I can say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the performances of Benedict Cumberbatch as Sherlock Holmes and, of course, Martin Freeman as Dr. Watson, they're very much right off the page. They encapsulate the relationship and the dynamic, but they also do so in much broader strokes, and they can flesh it out that much more in this modern interpretation. And, Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat have brilliantly done so, translated that to this modern epic series. You can see why it has such the fan following that it does, just by sampling it out and watching it for yourself. And as I say, I love, one of my favorite things about the series is all the references that they manage to fit in, and it's always intriguing to me how they rework scenarios. Like, as I was talking about in one of my previous videos discussing the series, Mycroft Holmes only appears in like 2 of the original canon stories, and he's very much ever present in this modern incarnation all throughout, from the very first episode, from the word go. And that is fascinating to me. Of course, Mark Gatiss has proved himself as an actor time and time and time again, and so he's enjoyable to watch as sort of a foil and, relative of Cumberbatch's titular Holmes. And we actually get introduced to their parents in this season, which blew my mind. A spin-off story, as written by Nicholas Meyer, that I always call back to, and I've talked about many times in any of my discussions about Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes Anything is the 7% Solution, and it's very interesting how Nicholas Meyer works the original canon around so that you have explanations for why Holmes eventually gives up his cocaine addiction. You have sort of insights into his psychology and how he views women, explored in that story in very interesting ways, and using the familial aspect to, give depth to that, give flavor to that. And we have it once again worked in a very unique and interesting way in this modern incarnation. Every step of the way, I love that there can be stories that really heavily parallel concepts, characters, and things like that, with the original canon. But then you have, like, as is the case of the second episode in this particular season, The Sign of 3, it's largely something else. It's something we haven't seen before. And with the opening episode, of course, The Empty Hearse, the draw for me, and that title, I might add as a brief aside, is based on the story The Empty House, which was Sherlock Holmes sort of returning to glory after Conan Doyle had wanted to kill off the character, and he was, basically sort of forced to bring him back, I guess you could say. Fan outcry and things of that sort. Everyone was so in love and intrigued with this character, they wanted him back. And so he had to bring back Holmes. And that, the Empty House story is interesting in that Holmes just kind of shows up. There's a dummy involved, and he just shows up, and Watson's kind of like, "You're back." And then the adventure continues, that kind of scenario. What I said in my previous season discussion video was, if Watson does not all out and out deck Holmes, and I didn't even know there'd be a span of 2 years that went by that Holmes was abroad and everyone assumed he was dead and everything like that, with the exception of select people in, the detective department and everything, who have all these conspiracy theories as to how he might be out there in the world, whatever, and coming back eventually. But if Watson did not out and out deck Holmes for this, just the emotional blow, how rocked he was in the thought that he had died and everything, I would be sorely disappointed. And he goes on the attack with Holmes when Holmes reveals himself not once, not twice, but 3 times, even to the point of headbutting him right in the schnoz. And I'm like loving it. I'm absolutely loving and adoring it, because it's like, that's exactly what needed to have happened, for me to be satisfied with that relationship dynamic. And of course, Watson eventually does warm back up to Holmes as all this, hilarity and mayhem is ensuing with the current crime. We do see, like the character of Molly. I thought it was very interesting how she is still ever present, and she was a character that really strongly redeemed herself to me in, season 2, and we see that she's an integral factor. And I love how they mess with you as far as how exactly did Holmes manage to fake his death? How did he convince not only Watson, but the, sort of sharpshooters, the assassins who were meant to be watching this unfold as Moriarty apparently blows his brains out, so that Holmes can't get the upper hand and everything like that. And they start off with this wacky explanation that was just irking me to high heaven, and we find out it's one of these conspiracy theories, and I was like, I'm glad that wasn't the explanation. And then they toy with it, throughout the entire first episode, The Empty Hearse, how exactly all these different things might have added up, and you're never quite sure what the truth actually is. The only things you can bank on is Mycroft had a hand in it. It was probably faked. They used like a body that happened to look very much like Holmes, and whatever the explanation was, you have to take it all with a grain of salt. There's probably more truth in each of these descriptions that you get, but you can't necessarily say any one of them is absolutely true as far as how he managed to do it. And very interesting footnote that I'll get out of the way right away is that, of course, by the end of this season, hints of Moriarty's return, just goosebumps at that. And what I really found intriguing, the addition of Mary Morstan being brought in, I love the reconfiguring going on. As I say, you have these broad strokes in adaptation and trying to call on and play on original concepts and characters from the original canon. But then you have players moved around and they're becoming different characters as the story unfolds. As you get into the Sign of 3, it's very much playing on the title, the Sign of 4, but this story has almost nothing to do with that. Some characters from the original canon do appear. The army officer Sholto, Jonathan Small, the photographer, and I love that there's actually a call to a dwarf shooting poison darts at one point in a sort of flashback at this big wedding event that's happening, as, of course, Holmes is the best man, and it is required upon his time to give a speech and all that kind of stuff, and that is just astounding to me, because in the original canon, Watson's just married, out of nowhere. We don't know anything really about the wedding, how exactly this all went down and such like that. And the concept of embracing, they're coming together in a very unique way. And I have to say, I loved the addition of Morstan, but I also felt very fishy about her character. In the very first scene that we see her in, in The Empty Hearse subsequently, or previously I should say, to the Sign of 3, is when, Holmes is effectively making his comeback and going to approach Watson for the first time, who's mustachioned in high flavor, in old school flavor, if you will. And I thought the way she was kind of not domineering in a negative sense, but she was kind of playfully forceful with Watson in, like, she knew he was going to propose to her right then and there, and she's kind of trying to push him along to get to it. I just felt like there's something slightly off here. More on that in a little bit, though. But as I say, you have this unfolding story at this wedding event where somebody is out to kill someone else, and it's playing on these loose threads that we've been picking up with, this guard at the, whatever it is, the palace or whatever, having been seemingly murdered by, a murderer unseen, an invisible man, and how that plays out with the belt and, sort of a thin blade kind of thing, coming into play. And how this is now going to affect the Sholto character, who, as I say, this is, the name of the character in any case is taken right off the page of the original canon. Now it added up to something very different, and I'll leave that to you, the viewer, to go check out, because, the more said about that character, probably spoilery territory to the original canon. I don't want to get too far into it. But suffice to say, I thought it was very captivating having this wedding event and how that all played out. And the idea that this was somebody very, this character had become somebody very close to Watson in his past, somebody who was a marked man, if you will, and how the three, it's not just Holmes and Watson, it's Morstan as well, not being intrusive, not being like, an added third wheel that you're uncomfortable watching. Having her involved in there, being very sort of human and down to earth, you can see why it is that Watson has fallen for her and vice versa. They will complement each other in similar but also different ways to how Holmes and Watson complement each other. And just the idea that she's sort of involved and she's the voice box for trying to touch the humanity of this Sholto soldier, and it seems like he's willing to almost let himself go out without a fight, and it's her talking to him as well as sort of creating a bridge of emotion through Holmes himself, through Watson himself as they're banging on that door trying to get him out. It was a really heartening scene to play out. And all through this entire wedding event, as I keep referring to it, you have this woman, I think her name was Janine, who's, damn, she's a hottie in her own right, very flirtatious. She's loving Holmes for his being able to observe and read everyone in high detail, cruising for maybe picking up a guy or something like that. And I thought it was really just mind-blowing as we get into the final of these 3 episodes, His Last Vow. Playing off of that, he's very much involved with the woman, and this does play on an original canon story, the name of which escapes me, but I think it might actually be because the villain of this series, if you will. There's kind of 2, sort of, but you have Charles Augustus Magnuson. He was originally known in the original canon as Charles Augustus Milverton, and this was actually a character, created by Conan Doyle based on somebody in real life who was a blackmailer, and Holmes just ruefully hates him, even more so than Moriarty. And what I really found interesting, kind of going all over the place, but one thought leads to another, with this Charles Augustus Magnuson, he is almost like, whereas the Moriarty of this modern series is a modern take on Moriarty, this villain is very much, to my mind, the modern equivalent of the classic Moriarty, without all necessarily the, hands in the webs of crime and everything like that. But he's an information broker and a blackmailer, and he uses the truth against people for his own devices, and we find it's very internally encased within his own mind, which is somewhat of a twist. And this, performance, this actor, who I was surprised to learn, the entire time I was thinking, he reminds me so much of Mads Mikkelsen. And I find out this is his brother in real life, his elder brother. I think his name is Lars Mikkelsen. I might be incorrect on the first name, but wow. I mean, just a complete, thunderstruck villain that is not a repeat offender, if you will, in the vein of the Moriarty we have in this modern series. They are 2 very different characters, and they come with their own sort of gravitas and weight. With the modern incarnation of Moriarty, he's very much psychotic. He's kind of like the Joker to Cumberbatch's Holmes's Batman, if you will. Whereas this Moriarty is kind of more like the Riddler. And again, it kind of, at least to my thinking, plays very much on the ominous and foreboding characterization of the original Moriarty from the canon. So you have 2 flavors of 2 different characters, but they're very much similar, in a similar vein, but they are characters in their own right. You can never, I don't think you could ever look at these 2 villains, the modern Moriarty and the modern Magnuson, if you will, and confuse them. They are both in their own right villains atop all, and very wowed performances. Just, I was riveted. But as I say, in the original story that featured this character known as Milverton in that story, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, Holmes does get engaged, and it's a matter of trying to get into the inner circle of the Milverton / Magnuson characters, where he has this information, the vaults or the safe wherein he keeps it. And the twist in the original story, I don't want to spoil it necessarily, but let's just say one of his previous victims is the one who's the bringer of justice, and Holmes and Watson just kind of leave it there. It's not their claim to fame to say they, got this guy and took him down. Whereas in this particular situation, whoa, I was gobsmacked by what Holmes does in this event. He kills him. Right there in front of Watson, as Mycroft is pulling up in this helicopter, because of course they have their location, on the GPS or whatever it is, so they can track them. As Mycroft is pulling up with this helicopter, and he's like, Mr. Holmes, Mr. Watson, get away from this guy, this Magnuson guy. I was almost waiting for him to open fire from the helicopter. But of course, Mycroft, that's kind of taking too many leaps ahead of the game. Mycroft wouldn't have done that. He would have wanted his hands on this guy and try to pick that information out of his mind and everything, and use it for some end. And maybe that's why Holmes did what he did. It wasn't just a matter of how he now was in personal conflict with Morstan, with Watson, and all the other people that have been affected, because effectively, of course, Holmes is hired to go after this guy by the woman who's being blackmailed in the episode. And so there are so many different things that were probably the impetus for him making that decision, putting the gun on the guy, and, but it was astounding to me because, of course, he is then going to be exiled, were it not for the revelation that soon comes later, just 4 minutes later, whatever it is, that, hey, Moriarty, did you miss me? That message, very ominous, and just goosebumps I had when they showed that on the screen, and you see Moriarty's face. And I absolutely love, like references. You have His Last Vow. It's playing on His Last Vow, which was, I think, the last, chronologically, the last story featuring Holmes where he was very much aged. He had a home out in the country. He kept bees. And calling back to this Janine character, she talks about, after sort of getting vengeance on, Holmes in the media, she's just bought a home, like I think it's Sussex or something like that. She's talking about getting rid of the bees that they have there. So again, references are rife and aplenty throughout the entirety of this season. And the twist with Mary, much as I was hinting at, I felt like there was something off about her character. I couldn't place what it was, and I don't necessarily want to say I could have seen how deep that went, with her being sort of a villain in her own right. That's why I say there's almost like two villains in this particular season. Her performance was captivating to me and intriguing to me in that I didn't necessarily like her from right off the bat. And I warmed to her, especially through that entire wedding event. And the subsequent, humanizing element of her talking down the Sholto character, who felt he was, condemned to death, and no matter what he did, and being the very human element in that. And then we find out there's more going on with this character. There was more going on with the Morstan character in the original canon, although it was completely different. It was a completely different scenario. But Watson does fall in love with her. He's very smitten with her in the original canon, and they do end up married. And there's even that whole aspect for Sherlockians. I don't know if the layperson who just is a fan of the series would pick up on this, but his middle name is Hamish, and I love that. I think I may have even talked about this in my previous, season discussion video. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But the idea that in the original canon, there's a story where I guess Conan Doyle was a little forgetful, and Mary calls John James. And there's a text message that she picks up on. It's like every 3 words in the message are the genuine words. Come find John. He's been kidnapped. He's been put in the bottom of this bonfire pit or whatever it is. You have 10 minutes to get there. And it says John or James. And then there's the idea, there's a fan theory, I don't remember who developed it, that said sort of calling back on this story, maybe James was like a pet name, a nickname that she came up with, because apparently the name Hamish is, some dialect of which I forget, some language, or it's derived from, something else, and it is the equivalent of the name James. So you have sort of an explanation at where that slip up might have come from, and they play on that multiple times. I think even going back to season 2, they first mentioned his name is Hamish. But of course, with the unfolding mystery of this unseen benefactor, this unseen murderer, one of the maids actually reveals that she knows this middle name, and she knows there's going to be a wedding going on when nobody should know it by that point. And so all of those little elements all throughout. And those are just the ones I picked up on. I mean, I'm sure I could probably, if I did a little more investigating, because though I am a Sherlockian, I'm not like, I'm not Sherlock in that mind, that intellectual mind, where I have my own, whatever he calls it, mental castle or whatever it is, that I can pick and go back to every single reference I've ever seen and noted. I'm sure there's going to be things that I'm not even aware of that went into the process of making these stories, writing these stories, filming these particular episodes. And it's superlatives aplenty. Once again, by the end of season 3 of Sherlock, I could not give it higher praise. The guest actors, the main actors, of course, Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman. This, as I say, Janine, hello nurse, or hello secretary, whatever you want to say. And just the idea of the addition of Morstan and the creative way they have reweaved these original stories and the characters that are featured in them, and how they've, played on those concepts. I mean, I love how you got sort of the homeless guy in the drug den. I was just a little bit miffed, as somebody who's a laid-back, straight edge, doesn't go near any alcohol, drugs, anything like that. It's a little bit miffed that we see Holmes giving in to that temptation, even though it is for a case, and it becomes tantamount to that case, arguably. But the one guy who's like guarding the building that Watson goes to get the neighbor's kid back from, or whatever it is, which also I believe is a reference to the original canon. I'd have to go looking back and see if I'm remembering that correctly. But I mean, this one guy, the character name eludes me, but I'm almost positive he's one of, in the original canon, the Baker Street Irregulars. And so, it's that homeless network is the modern equivalent of the Baker Street Irregulars, all these sort of, kids on the street, orphans and such like that were the information network for Holmes to combat the criminal network in London town. And to see all that stuff coming to light, I just love this series. I didn't expect it to be as masterful as it has totally played out to be since watching the very first episode of season 1. It completely blew my mind. And I cannot wait for the Christmas episode this year. My friend Howard, who sent me the 3 seasons, thank you very much once again, sir, for doing so. Your kindness knows no bounds. And it was a long time coming by the time I finally got to catch up with this. But I'm looking forward to that Christmas episode, calling back on the classic style. As a big-time fan of the Grenada series, that is almost word for word right off the page, and one of the best adaptations you'll ever see. But this is a modern equivalent of that. The style, the just, gravitas, the weightiness, the pathos, and the intrigue of these characters, of the performances. Nothing rivals it, as far as I'm concerned. I'm even like a fan of the Robert Downey Jr. films, and they are good in their own right. Doesn't even beat what you got right here, And so yeah, I could go on all day long, about this particular series, about this particular season in the series. I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below what you thought of Sherlock Season 3 in its entirety, the 3 episodes, once again, those being The Empty Hearse, The Sign of 3, and His Last Vow, and also the idea that The Sign of 3, Mary is pregnant by the end too. They're going to be welcoming a daughter. It's like, that is goosebumps too. Just the idea that Watson's life is effectively and has been evolving, and so has the relationship dynamics between he and Holmes and everything. It's just incredible. Goosebumps upon goosebumps, as Bugs Bunny might say. And so, yeah, as I say, I'd love to hear from you what you thought of the series, what you thought of the episodes, if it was as good as, the previous 2 seasons to you, if you didn't like it as much. Anything goes in the comments below. I love having the conversation. So that'll be enough of my yakking, and I will catch you all later. Peace.